Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and hello to everybody watching this later on. So my name is Adam Peacock. Many of you probably know me. I sort of lead on the engagement in Zero Carbon Rugeley, the user-centric design component. So, engaging with the local community, trying to understand your experiences and your perspectives, and trying to help work with you to sort of map a future energy system for the Rugeley community. We've been focusing a lot lately on local transport. We've come back to you having learned from your own experiences and developed some ideas about how we could potentially make local transport more sustainable. But also what we wanted to do was to give the opportunity to provide information, particularly from the perspective of people that are already starting to perhaps navigate through some of this mysterious technology that's coming forward to try and save the planet. It's an excellent week for us to be hosting this talk with COP26 ongoing, and we're very fortunate to have Dr. Richard Waller here from Keele University, where I also work, to be doing a talk about everything you'd wanted to know about EVs but were afraid to ask. So Rich, thank you very much for coming. I'll turn my video off and hand over to you.
Brilliant. Good evening, everyone. I hope you can hear me all right, and I hope you can see the slides, and thanks for giving up some of your precious time this evening. Everything you wanted to know about EVs were, but maybe not afraid to ask, but maybe didn't know who to ask. So as an EV owner for a few years, I thought I'd be delighted to kind of share some of my experiences with you. So just the kind of things that I want to go through this evening. I think start off with some introductions. Maybe we kind of can save the introductions and have a bit of an opportunity for a conversation at the end for those of you who are present. But I'll at least give an introduction to myself. Then I'll kind of provide you with a bit of an introduction to electric vehicles, which are maybe rather more. They've been around for rather longer than most people imagine, seen as a rather newfangled technology. Then kind of talk about, well, why switch to an EV? What are the potential benefits? Run through some of the common questions and concerns. Look at the future prospects, what I think is, which is hopefully very relevant to the broader plans that I'm aware of are in train for the Zero Carbon Rugeley project, and then leave you with some suggestions of where to find out more information if you're interested. And I'm certainly happy to provide a sort of copy of like a handout of the slides, and also I'll probably try and provide some kind of handout in which I'll provide a link to some of the core resources that I'll refer to in the talk. And then there's an opportunity, if there's anyone still around, we can do this via chat, or we can do it, you can kind of unmute yourself if that's an opportunity to have a bit of a quick Q&A at the end. So by way of introduction, then I've owned an EV for almost 3 years now. I've got a Hyundai Kona, and I've driven this is my first battery electric vehicle for over 50,000 miles. Throughout the UK. This is a picture from September when I was on the Shetland Isles sea kayaking. So drove all the way up to Aberdeen and then around the different parts of the Shetland Isles. And since getting a battery electric vehicle, it's really helped me develop a research interest in sort of electric mobility, and also the provision of charging infrastructure. This is my traditional background has been as a sort of like a glaciologist, working on the impacts of climate change on glaciers and permafrost. But I see my sort of research interests pivoting to those kinds of things that we can do in order to kind of decarbonize society. So in moving kind of quickly on to an introduction to electric vehicles, the first thing I just want to highlight, they're not a new technology. I mean, I remember when I was a nipper, and you still see these around sort of Stoke-on-Trent, having a battery electric vehicles in the form of milk floats delivering our daily pinter. And so, milk floats as a battery electric vehicle have been running around since the 1930s. And if we look at electric vehicles in general, they've been around for even longer than that. The first electric carriage was invented by Robert Anderson in Scotland in the 1830s. the sale of the first commercial electric vehicles took place in Belgium in 1890. If we look to the US, and I think the same was the case in Europe, initially when motor vehicles were first being launched, there was something of a competition between steam-powered vehicles, electric vehicles, and combustion engine vehicles. And in 1900, 38% of the cars that were sold in the US were electric versus 22% from combustion engine cars. Combustion engine cars then sort of won that battle, and we went into sort of like the dark ages for electric vehicles. But then in the 1970s, you started to get the return of some sort of passenger vehicles that were based on electric drivetrains. But it was the lead acid battery, the weight of that, which limited the range. So it's the development of lithium-ion batteries as a new battery technology in the 1980s that really sort of kick-started the current interest in battery electric vehicles, led to the launch of the Toyota Prius as the first mass-produced hybrid vehicle in 1997, and then the launch of the Tesla Roadster, Tesla's first fully electric vehicle with a range of over 200 miles in 2008. And from that time, we've seen a significant acceleration in the market share associated with battery electric vehicles. This is showing car registrations and market share in Europe, and you can see how that's we're on that sort of S curve, that things are starting to really accelerate now. Just last month, the Tesla Model 3 was the top-selling car in Europe, period. So topped the sales charts. So, things are changing, and things are changing very rapidly. We're moving out of that sort of first adopter phase, and various kind of sort of commercial organizations and research organizations like Bloomberg New Energy Finance see this change accelerating in the years to come. So what is an electric vehicle? It's worthwhile subdividing the different types of electric vehicle that are available on the market. The first of the modern electric vehicles to appear were cars like the Toyota Prius, which is I guess it's just called a hybrid these days. So a hybrid is where you have a combination of a conventional, combustion engine in the car, and that's coupled to an electric drivetrain. So you've got a battery in the vehicle as well. So it isn't an EV; it's got an electric part component to drivetrain. But a conventional hybrid EV, you can only recharge that battery through regenerative braking. So as you slow down, the motor turns into a dynamo, and it uses that to recover that energy and put it back into the battery. You then got the development of so-called PHEVs, or plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. These are ones where they've got a larger battery. You can also plug the car in order to kind of charge it up. And run the car for maybe, with some modern hybrids, plug-in hybrids, up to about 50 miles or so, but they've still got a combustion engine, and still a combustion engine, depending on your journeys, will do a lot of provide a lot of the motion. Then you've got battery electric vehicles. This is where you then completely dispense with the combustion engine, and the car is in reality very straightforward. It just involves a battery pack and electric motor. And they have ranges of anywhere between 100 and 300 miles. And then you have fuel cell electric vehicles. So these are where you've got cars that are fueled by hydrogen. That hydrogen is run through a hydrogen fuel cell to generate electricity. That goes into the battery, and the battery then drives the motor. So fuel cell electric vehicles based on hydrogen still have batteries with them. They're still electric vehicles, and they have the potential for more rapid refueling and longer ranges, but they've got a lower efficiency than battery electric vehicles, and they're more costly to run because hydrogen is still very expensive. I should say that I'm going to be focusing solely on battery electric vehicles during this talk. And just one last thing to add in is sometimes people talk about plug-in electric vehicles. That's just the PHEVs and the battery electric vehicles. They're ones you can literally plug into the electricity supply, and the implications of that we'll see in a moment, a little bit later in the talk. But it's only the latter two which are associated with genuine zero tailpipe emissions. So why switch to an EV? Well, I mean, this sort of slide provides the first obvious example. Why? Well, if we have any sort of concerns related to atmospheric pollution and the various different kind of pollutants in terms of particulate matter and nitrous oxides related to vehicle exhausts, then electric vehicles, full electric vehicles, are zero tailpipe emissions. So it's a good way of reducing the pollution related to transport, for starters. I will try my luck in terms of showing. There's one of the websites that I'll recommend at the end is run by this guy, Dr. Ewan McTurk, who's based up in Scotland, and he's got his fabulous YouTube channel called Plug Live Television. I'm wondering whether I'm going to question my sanity in terms of stopping the sharing and resharing again. But let's give it a whirl. Let's be ambitious. So hopefully you can still see this, and I'll play this. He was given the brief of trying to explain why you should drive an electric car in 60 seconds. So we'll give this a try. Oh no. We just managed to get the audio to work. Oh, never mind. I'll send you a link to that. We're having more than one set of challenges with Zoom this evening. It wasn't working, and then it was working. I thought, great, it's working now, and now it's not working again. But that's no problem. I shall send you the link to that and many other resources, so you can have a look at that and see why Ewan thinks we should drive an electric car in 60 seconds. It's a great little primer. But I thought an obvious place to start, seeing as it's the week of COP26, is to start off by considering the environmental benefits of switching to a battery electric vehicle. And if we think about transport more generally, then the transport sector is estimated responsible for the release of 8 billion tons per year of carbon dioxide. So roughly 25% of the total emissions of humanity are associated with us moving around and us using transport. And roughly 3/4 of those transport emissions relate to road transport. So huge amounts of emissions, and therefore huge potential for emission savings related to road transport. If we look globally, about 1.2 billion cars are in operation. These are figures from last year, but there's a net addition of 100 million cars every year. So basically, from a carbon emissions perspective, and COP26 and reducing emissions to half of their current values within the next 10 years, the transport sector, unfortunately, is heading in exactly the wrong direction. And if we end up looking at the UK, you can hopefully see that we've made some real steps forward in terms of energy generation. For example, you can see the blue line. I'm not sure whether you can see my pointer. But the blue line, you can see the reduction in the carbon footprint associated with energy, and that related to the move away from coal and the growth in renewables. But we can see that transport has flatlined to the point that by the time we get to 2018 here, it's become again the dominant source of terrestrial carbon emissions in the UK as well. So it's a key area where it's been very resistant to any attempts to reduce our carbon emissions. And if I remember when I was a kid, we drove around in little super minis, Renault 5, Peugeot 104, all kinds of little cars like that. Now we seem to have a big penchant for driving around in very large and relatively fuel inefficient sports utility vehicles. So the automobile industry persuading us to move around and to buy progressively larger and less efficient cars has been seen as the second biggest cause of an increase in carbon emissions in the 21st century so far. So we need to bend the curve in the opposite direction. Now, I would be the first to say, I'm not saying that we should end up all moving to battery electric vehicles. I would always be keen to say, well, the first thing we should say is, do we need to actually use the car? The greater use of active transport, and can we just walk or cycle to the shops to pick up that pint of milk? Greater use of public transport as well is always going to be more efficient. Then obviously there's a prospect of moving to more efficient engines, but they're a mature technology now, so there's little in the way of increase in efficiency that we can drive from petrol or diesel engines. could move to low carbon fuels, but then there's always that kind of question mark about, well, where are those low carbon fuels? If they're biofuels, then couldn't that land be used for better purposes? And I think that's why there's been a lot of interest in terms of the electrification of drivetrains, in particular when they're coupled with an increase in the use of renewables. And obviously that's become a central plank of the government's 10-point plan. And the bit of that which kind of generated the most column inches was in bringing forward the banning of new petrol and diesel cars originally from 24 right forward to 2030. So this is seen as a sort of a key area of policy for delivering rapid reductions in carbon emissions in order to reach net zero to halve emissions by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050. Now, if we look at the carbon footprint of any vehicle, then the carbon footprint, the life cycle carbon footprint of any vehicle is associated with its production, with its use phase and the fuel you're burning, and also with the end of life, its disposal, or hopefully its recycling and the energy inputs related to that. Now, of course, right from the word go, a battery electric vehicle is associated with a problem in terms of you've got to produce not just the vehicle, but you've got to produce the battery, and the batteries are still resource and energy intensive. So to start off with, there is a carbon penalty. However, and these lines here, for example, A is like a little car. The blue is the electric vehicle, and the grey lines are a conventional combustion engine vehicle. So if we look at A, the battery electric vehicle will start off with a higher carbon footprint related to its production. However, you can see the sort of the gradient is lined during its use phase is lower. So the carbon emissions associated with its fuel use is lower, and therefore you see you reach this break-even point, and by the time you've reached the end of the life of that vehicle, then you've actually had a carbon saving. Now, because your electric vehicle is powered by electricity, then the carbon footprint during that use phase is determined by the source of the energy you use. So if you were to power your battery electric vehicle purely by electricity generated by coal, there would basically be little, if any, benefit environmentally about using that versus a combustion engine car. However, if you look at the bottom line, if you start to think about running your car using renewable energy, using wind, and if you start to then think about using renewables within the production of the vehicle to reduce that embedded carbon, which most manufacturers are doing now, then there is the potential for some really significant reductions in the carbon footprint during its life cycle. So if we end up looking at, there's a fabulous book, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, which I thoroughly recommend for the carbon footprint of everything, is this book, How Bad Are Bananas, produced by Mike Berners-Lee. And if we look at his kind of figures related to the carbon footprint of travel, this would be a return return trip from London to Glasgow, return about 411 miles. Must be further than 411 miles. Anyway, I need to check that. But anyway, these are the comparative figures. I'm not suggesting we'd all bike there. That would clearly be ludicrous. But you can see for say, a train, you've got about 64 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent. So when it says carbon dioxide equivalent, that means it's not just considering the carbon dioxide emissions, it's including things like methane emissions that were very much in the news today. And you can see that a small battery electric vehicle just with the driver is 148. So if you had a driver and a passenger, then that would be down to, that would halve the value per person. So you'd be down to what's that, sort of 74. So you'd be in a sort of situation where the carbon footprint related to using a battery electric vehicle would be, similar to and sort of consistent with forms of public transport. Conversely, if you end up looking at one person driving a large SUV, their Range Rover, they'd be kind of burning over a ton of carbon dioxide, total carbon over that sort of same journey. So our choices in terms of vehicles are really important, and the opportunity to kind of move to a small battery electric vehicle would have the potential to deliver quite significant reductions. Of course, the other benefit is if you're plugging your vehicle into the grid, we've already seen that the carbon intensity of the grid has reduced over time. And if that's set to continue, then just by having a battery electric vehicle, you can then benefit from that reduction in the carbon footprint, and your battery electric vehicle will continue to get greener over time as the grid decarbonizes. In terms of a cost side of things, in terms of how much do you save, let's tackle the elephant in the room to start off with. Battery electric vehicles are still very expensive. They are too expensive to see really mass adoption. And so, you'd be looking at a cost premium, quite commonly of about £10,000 or so over and above if you were to, to buy it outright over the combustion engine equivalent. And that was the case for me when I bought my own. But the key thing which I sort of identified was with the savings associated with its use phase. So the reduced operating costs. So here's just a back of an envelope calculation compared to my previous car, which was a 1.2 litre Skoda Fabia, so hardly a pocket rocket. So assuming I had about an average fuel economy of that 45 miles per gallon, so a pretty fuel efficient car, I sort of drive about 20,000 miles a year because I'm driving back and forth between Kiel and Penrith, which is where I'm speaking to you at the moment. That would relate to about just over 2,000 litres of fuel, and at current costs of about £1.40 per litre, you're talking about just over £2,800 per year on fuel costs alone. And total carbon dioxide emissions, this is kind of calculated using the UK government's greenhouse gas conversion factors of just over 5 tonnes of carbon per year. Now with the EV I use, I've got an average efficiency of about 3.5 miles I can drive for every kilowatt hour of electricity I put into it. So that's about just under 5,500 kilowatt hours. I've got an overnight tariff, which means I can charge up at 5p a kilowatt hour. So that means I'm charging up for about, less than 300 quid. So I've got a saving of over £2,500 per year in terms of those fuel costs. And if I run the sort of calculations by the government statistics, I've got a carbon footprint of just over a tonne. So saving over 4 tonnes of carbon per year as well. And when you add in the fact that you've got lower servicing costs, you've got lower maintenance costs, and of course, zero road tax, then those operating costs suddenly become much more attractive. And of course, relatively few people in this day and age actually buy vehicles. They'll tend to lease them. So I'll provide you with some links to, there are various companies. This is not an advert. These are just companies that I'm aware of. I know that Drive Electric has been around for some time, which does some sort of like longer term leases. There are things like Octopus, for example, which is a major energy company that's also doing EV leases as well, and certainly doing that for businesses as part of salary sacrifice schemes. And then there is a company called Onto that, if you want to dip your toe in the water, will do sort of like leases for as little as 1 month. If you wanted to just give something a try and see how you got on with it. And of course, there is always that opportunity of going secondhand. There are various different providers of secondhand EVs, and a guy, Jonathan Porterfield, is renowned amongst EV enthusiasts. He has got a website called EcoCars, and he's seen as a great person to go to for general advice if you're interested in the secondhand market. So sort of moving on to some common questions and concerns. Again, I'll just take some common questions about electric vehicles that were taken from this little video. And the common questions can be things like, can you do a longer journey, or are they really only suitable for commuting? Where do I charge it? Does it have enough power? Are they rubbish to drive? What happens to the batteries as they age? Do they just degrade over time? And I've already dealt with the fifth part they do on that in terms of how much do you really save. So in terms of can they do longer journeys, absolutely. I mean, as I say, I've in the space of under 3 years driven over 50,000 miles. I've driven the length and breadth of the British Isles. But I would say that you are in a sort of situation still where you need to do some planning to figure out where you're going to stop and charge. And when you include that time related to the charging, your journeys will take a little longer as a consequence. But if you end up thinking I'm going to be saving 20 or 30 quid during the course of that, then I always talk about the EV bonus. If you have a free meal on the way, then I don't think that's that's a reasonable trade-off as far as I'm concerned. And this kind of gives an illustration. These I'll highlight some resources you can use to find out about charging infrastructure. This shows the chargers between Kiel and John O'Groats, and all of these orange symbols show the chargers en route. So there are in large parts of the country, and certainly along the main routeways, there are lots of, and there are increasing numbers of chargers that are available on those routeways. So where do you charge, or where can I charge? Well, most of the time, if you make that transition to an electric vehicle, then you'll make use of so-called destination chargers. That's where you're leaving the car parked up somewhere. So typically, they'll either be at home or at work. So this is an old charger I used to have, which we had installed at the house, just before I kind of took ownership of a battery electric vehicle. And that does mean, of course, that having a battery electric vehicle is going to be a lot simpler if you have off-street parking, and that's something I'll come back to in a moment. But I don't have any off-street parking at Kiel. I've got sort of a terraced house down in Kiel, so I charge the car at work. And in that respect, I think it's estimated that most cars spend at least 95% of their time, unless you're a taxi driver, stationary. So that provides the time in which you can charge them under these relatively slow rate chargers over several hours. Of course, there are many people who don't have access to off-street parking, and there are some interesting developments in terms of on-street charging facilities. In terms of these charging points, or on the right-hand side, you can see which are even using the surplus power available within street infrastructure like street lights, in order to kind of provide people with the opportunity to charge where they don't have that off-street parking. Of course, if you do longer journeys, or again, an alternative if you don't have off-street parking, is to use so-called rapid chargers. So these rapid chargers are chargers with faster charge rates. And these are the kinds of things that you would tend to use if you're making longer journeys, which are longer than the range of your vehicle. So they'll have faster charging powers, and you might sort of stop for the order of somewhere between, I don't know, 15 and 50 minutes or so, something along those lines, in order to kind of charge your car and then head another, 150 miles or so down the road. But I should say that there's a lot of interest in rapid chargers, and you do use them in longer journeys. But for the majority of your time, and certainly if you've got that ability to have off-street parking, you'll find that the majority of your time you're just charging either at work or at home overnight. And things are really improving in relation to charging infrastructure. We're starting to get the development, for example, of these snazzy new electric forecourts. This is the first one, and these are rolling out across the UK. It looks like a service station. Well, it is kind of like a service station, but designed for EVs. So this has opened up in Essex last December, has 36 charging stalls for cars, significant retail space, including a showroom for electric vehicles. And it's also connected to a nearby large solar farm, which is providing a significant amount of the energy, which is then going into those battery electric vehicles. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But I want to be honest in terms there are still parts of the country where chargers can be few and far between. I spend a lot of my time going to North Wales and going sea kayak in Anglesey, and let's just say that chargers are not as extensive on the ground as we would like. Those blanks are starting to sort of fill in, but there are some areas in which things are a little bit more challenging than they should be, and I want to be honest about that. And we are still in a situation where here is a whole series of cards that I have for my car. You can still get a number of chargers which it can be quite difficult. You have to subscribe and get an RFID card, and then use that to initiate the charge. Again, that's an area which is improving rapidly, not quite there yet, but the majority of chargers now you can end up using with a simple contactless card. Does it have enough power? I'll put this as a link. It's one of my favorite kind of trips, favorite sort of videos. Absolutely. I can honestly say, hand on heart, that my car that I've got, my battery electric vehicle, is by far the best car that I've ever owned, both in terms of its power and in terms of its ease to drive, and just something which is very relaxing to drive. So you'll have absolutely no problem from that perspective. They're not like milk floats. Will the battery degrade? The batteries are lasting far longer than anyone originally anticipated. Plenty of sort of situations. You know, this is a well-known sort of example of a Nissan Leaf that was used by a battery firm down in Cornwall, which was used for 174,000 miles before it was passed on to another owner, and it still had 70% of its original capacity after driving 174,000 miles. And if you end up with things like posh Teslas, you know, you've got Teslas which are doing 250,000 kilometers and they've still got 90% of their capacity left. I mean, one thing just to mention there is people end up saying, well, look at the degradation on your mobile phone. The big difference between something like a mobile phone or a laptop is that they don't have any systems within that battery which keeps that battery cool. Battery electric vehicles have cooling systems which will keep their battery at a safe operating temperature, stopping it getting too hot in particular, so they don't show the same rates of degradation as you would do for a lithium-ion battery, smaller lithium-ion battery that was in a phone or a laptop. And you know, if you end up in a situation about I think the good thing about battery electric vehicles is they're very consistent with the idea of a circular economy. Even when the batteries are at the end of their useful life for the battery electric vehicle, they can be used for static energy storage to support the grid, or even in domestic situations. There are a number of companies that provide domestic batteries for houses that are basically the repurposing of batteries from battery electric vehicles. And ultimately, you know, all of the materials within battery electric vehicles can be recycled and put into new batteries. So it's an area which is entirely kind of consistent with you know, a circular economy, which again is something that everyone agrees we need to move towards. So in terms of moving towards the end and just thinking about some of the exciting future prospects, which I've become aware of certainly at sort of Kiel, and I've started to adopt at home, and also which I think have some interesting and exciting applications and relevance to the Zero Carbon Rugeley project, is that, first of all, I should say that, you know, that whilst the automotive industry would like us all to make a straight one-for-one swap between our combustion engine cars to electric vehicles, then clearly that's not a desirable way forward. We want to, at the same time, have less individual cars on the road. You know, all switching to battery electric vehicles is not going to deal with congestion, for example. So I think there are some interesting developments in terms of EV car sharing that could both limit the number of cars we have on the road and also make you know, EVs, or the ability to use EVs, much more accessible. So that's certainly something, and a lot of the rental cars and car sharing cars companies are moving towards that car sharing model. Moving towards electric vehicles as the focus of that model. But I think the interesting thing of relation to Zero Carbon Rugeley is the connection of as soon as you start to power your car by electricity, then suddenly you can connect it to these so-called smart energy networks. So you have the ability to integrate your mobility in your vehicle with any sort of energy systems that you have within a domestic context. So, you know, I've gone through a fairly common route amongst sort of battery electric vehicle early adopters, which is to sort of get your battery electric vehicle, suddenly start to think about where your electricity comes from. And of course, you're using a lot more electricity when you start to use a battery electric vehicle. And then you start to think, well, hang on a sec, can I grow my own? So that leads you in the direction of thinking, well, you know, maybe I can install solar PV. And so we move into a situation where now suddenly cars and the fuels they use are suddenly start to become kind of connected with buildings and their electricity supplies. So just a, an interesting quotation here, I think, of relevance to Zero Carbon Rugeley project. The future transport system will be more integrated with smart buildings, the electric grid, renewables, and information ecosystems, allowing for great opportunities to exploit these interconnections. And so for me personally, then we installed solar panels in middle of January. And then I upgraded my EV charger to get one of these chargers, myenergi Zappi. myenergi, by the way, is a fabulous company, a British startup that started about 5 or 6 years ago. All of the equipment that they generate, which is all related to clean tech, is not just designed, but it's also manufactured in the UK. And what they produced in terms of the Zappi was a charger that means you can divert surplus solar energy from your solar PV to your car. And if you look, I downloaded this data yesterday. This is from the charger outside my house. So you can see here to date, I've put 1,480 kilowatt hours into my battery electric vehicle. 652 of those kilowatt hours have been from the grid. 827 are green. 827 have come from the solar PV on the roof. Now that ratio is changing, but still at the moment I'm in a situation where more of the energy that I put into the car when I'm charging at home has come from the solar panels than has come from the grid. And to put that into miles, if I've got an average efficiency on my car of 3.7 miles, that means I've driven over 3,000 miles in the car from surplus solar, which has been homegrown from the solar PV on the roof, which blows my mind. And there's nothing that puts a smile on your face more than driving an EV around with energy that you've generated from your own solar PV. And all of the research indicates it's that combination of home generation of renewables, in particular solar PV, and then putting that into an electric vehicle, which is the most environmentally friendly. It's associated with the most efficiency in terms of both the carbon footprint, the land footprint, and the water footprint. So if we want to end up thinking about modes of transportation that have the lowest environmental impact, then it's that combination of local renewables with battery electric vehicles, which is seen as one of the best options. The other thing which I'm learning at the moment is that when you have a battery electric vehicle, then you can make use of so-called time of use tariffs. So Octopus, for example, has a tariff called Go and also a tariff called Agile. Generally, when we're buying energy, we pay a flat rate for the whole of the year. But in reality, the price of energy varies on a half-hour basis. So there are various different, and I'm used to, again, this, I'm sure we're all used to this back in the day, economy 7, when most houses had an immersion, had a hot water tank, you would charge that up overnight. It's the same thing with a battery electric vehicle. So for me, then I've got 4 hours overnight when I can charge at 5p a kilowatt hour. The rest of the day it's 25p a kilowatt hour. And I just basically set the house up to charge the car, to charge the battery in the house at the moment, and to charge the hot water tank overnight, and then not trouble the grid during the remaining 20 hours. And that means that not only is your energy cheaper, your energy is cleaner, because the carbon footprint, the carbon intensity of the energy is generally much lower overnight when there's less demand and there's more reliance on renewables. And I think a really interesting thing that we're just is in its infancy, but is just around the corner, is the idea that you can use your battery electric vehicle as an energy source for your house. So we're rapidly moving to a situation where not only can you just charge your battery electric vehicle, then you can have the current going in the other direction, and you could use your battery electric vehicle that's sat on your drive for most of the time to actually to power the house in what's known as vehicle to grid or vehicle to home. So your battery electric vehicle in that situation could fulfill the twin role of not just being your mobility, but also being a very large battery storage on wheels. And this is something that the National Grid is extremely keen on, And it's thought that as we move towards more in the way of the use of renewables, then we're going to have more battery storage. Much better to end up making use of that battery storage that's available within those vehicles rather than building much more, sort of static storage on a national basis. So battery electric vehicles, in that sense, from balancing supply and demand as being part of the solution rather than part of the problem. So just to finish, in terms of where to find out more, and I will kind of make sure that I send on a sort of like a little sort of a sheet of resources that you with links on. The Fully Charged Show is a fabulous site to go on, which has got all kinds of information, all kinds of mini series related to electric vehicles and clean tech in general. And they've got a little mini series called Maddie Goes Electric, a beginner's guide to driving electric vehicle, which is something I'd thoroughly recommend if you're thinking of making that switch. Plug Live Television, which I was going to try and show the video on but didn't work, is again for those of you who want to look at things in a bit more detail. He's an electrochemist that works for a company up in Scotland, did his PhD on battery electric vehicles. So that'll provide you with more obscene and graphic detail if you want to go into that detailed aspect of battery electric vehicles. If you got to the stage of you're actually looking at what battery electric vehicle to drive, then I'd recommend the EV database. And that will provide you with information on individual cars, what the prices are, potential lease costs related to that, but in particular, really realistic real ranges of what you'd expect in different types of driving and at different types of year, rather than just going with something called the WLTP range, which is rather sort of like the absolute best case scenario that you can almost ever get. And the other thing I'd sort of recommend is if you're thinking of making the switch and you're worried about charging infrastructure, I'd recommend downloading one of the apps. ZapMap is probably the best known one, but I tend to use PlugShare. Although if I look at Rugeley here, it looks like there's more of the charging, the data is more up to date maybe on ZapMap. Just download it and just have a look around. Have a look at the typical journeys you make, have a look at where the charging infrastructure is, and you can start to get your sense of the lie of the land before you make the jump. Anyway, so I'll stop things there just to say thank you very much for listening, whether you're here live or whether you're watching this on catch up, and be more than happy to try and address any questions that you might have. So I'll stop my sharing there.
Thank you very much, Rich. That was fantastic. Very comprehensive oversight of electric vehicles, and even I learned something there. That was great. We've got a couple of questions and comments in the chat. So if I just sort of read them out to you, perhaps we could get your reactions to them.
Yeah.
So Laura says the challenge is for people who have long distance driving for their job roles. Any thoughts as to ideal solution for this, i.e. what model to go for?
I mean, I would look at the rain. I think it's a really important point. Is a matter of looking at the standard journeys that you have to make. And I think if you've got journeys that are within that sort of 150-mile range, and you've got the ability to charge at home, it's not an issue. Most battery electric vehicles now will have ranges where you can get, getting on for sort of 200 miles. On a good day, which means that on a bad day you're looking more like sort of 150 miles in that sense. So if your journeys fit within, I'd say that sort of 150-mile range during the course of the day, then you should be able to make those journeys relatively easily, pretty easily. I mean, if there are any individual cases like that, I think one of the things I'm interested in doing is I'd be happy to end up setting up some sort of forum or some kind of situation where we can end up looking at individual people's sort of situations, what their journeys look like, what the cars are out there, and I'd be happy to, to help out there. I think the other thing you'd end up then looking for, and that's why I was very lucky at Kiel to end up having the charging infrastructure, is to think, well, if I'm driving somewhere, is that I think we'll see an increasing number of workplaces that have charging infrastructure. So if you're going somewhere and you're going to be there for a few hours, you're going to a meeting, it should be a matter of routine, and it's worthwhile asking that question. I mean, all of these companies are going to have to be reporting on their carbon emissions, and there's going to be very strong pressure on them to try drive down those emissions and these sort of so-called scope 3 emissions. So, you know, that will be another thing in terms of wherever you're driving to for work, is then sort of seeing whether there are some charging options either at the work or maybe within sort of like a car park, you know, near there. But yeah, so that would be the thing. Hopefully you wouldn't have to charge, and if you did have to charge, then I'd always say look at those destination charges either at the workplace at the other end. And then if not, you know, you'd be in a situation where you're looking at maybe some rapid charger. You know, my rapid chargers you might want to stop at, for example, on the, you know, way back if you had a coffee, something like that. But I think one of the things I'm particularly keen to do is to sort of set up a little bit of I mean, one of the things which I think, this is a very long answer to a short question, is I get the sense there are a lot of people making the transition to battery electric vehicles, but then it's not getting the opportunity for much in the way of training. And you know, they are related to a different drivetrain, and there are some things that you have to learn. So I'm particularly keen to end up sort of setting up sort of training sessions, that opportunity to kind of, you know, to basically tell you what I've learned over the course of my 3 years of ownership. And we could look at particular sort of examples of journeys, and then I could talk you through, you know, what I would advise, or how you would make that calculation of A, could I make that journey without a problem, or B, if I did have to stop and charge, you know, what would be my list of sort of priorities or where I would stop and charge. And I should say, you know, if I can learn how to do this, anyone can. And I've done that 50,000 miles without ever running out of charge. So, you know, it does take a bit of planning, but you can do that. So hopefully that'll be an opportunity for a bit of a follow-up conversation.
Great, brilliant. Thank you very much. I think if there's interest there, again, for anyone watching tonight or anyone watching sort of, you know, later on, just get in touch with us if that's something you're interested in setting up. I know Rich is very keen for it. More power to the community. That, you know, that's what myself and Ryan stand for. So yeah, if you're interested in setting that up, do let us know, because, you know, that's something we would be keen. Okay, so Leslie says Zoom is clearly teasing us tonight. You're not wrong there. But also says, I don't have massive mileage, but the cost of electric cars is really high. So I'd need something that is cheaper to ensure cost benefit. Due to retire next year and won't have loads of money to spare. Any thoughts on that, Rich?
Yeah, I would certainly agree at the moment, in terms of, you know, the economics start to, you know, the economics make more sense when you get to the sort of situation where you have, yeah, when you've got those longer, you know, where you've got longer mileages during the course of the year. You know, I think it's certainly, you know, the secondhand market has, you know, the prices have increased, but, you know, if the cost of purchase up front, again, it comes back to the kinds of journeys you make. You know, I've spoken to a couple of people up here in Penrith, and they've got sort of secondhand battery electric vehicles. They realized all they wanted was something sort of commute and visit their friends. You know, their journeys were basically everything you could do within 50 miles. You know, in that situation, sort of getting an older Nissan Leaf or something like that, which might have a bit of a degraded battery, but, you know, if you can still 80 you know, miles within that car, then it really shouldn't be you know, it shouldn't be a problem. So, you know, maybe that's an illustration or example or something to look at.
What happens if there's an emergency and you need to charge? What happens if there is a power cut?
I mean, if you in theory had a power cut that affected absolutely everywhere, yeah, that would be, you know, problematic. But I've you know, in 3 years, we've had I've had 2 power cuts I can think of over 3 years, and we've seen the same thing, I guess, related to the, you know, to liquid fuels. I mean, in terms of the cost side of things, it will depend on your energy tariff. I mean, most of us have an energy tariff where it's just a flat rate. You know, you're charging XP per kilowatt hour. So in that kind of situation, then it doesn't matter. You just charge whenever you want, and it's immaterial when you charge. Sort of like a power cut in your home or something like that, but there would always be some other options as well. You know, you would always be in a sort of situation where, I mean, if I in extremis, or I had a problem or something like that, I'd go and visit the rapid chargers that we have in Penrith. So I think these are natural concerns or anxieties to have, but certainly you're in a situation where if you have you know, off-street parking, certainly, then I think I get the sense that our power network is extremely reliable, and the number of power outages that we have, certainly compared with people I follow in the US, is very limited. Hopefully not something you would really need to worry about any more than you need to worry about a situation that we've had recently where you might have struggled to get petrol or diesel.
Okay, thank you very much, Rich. So Laura also says, does it cost to charge at parking, i.e. at Tesco's, for example?
A lot of that charge, it'll depend on the provider, but a lot of that charging is still free. It's seen as a sort of like an incentive. Places are starting to charge now, but still the costs of charging, it ends up being, it's always significantly cheaper than the cost of using sort of petrol or diesel. But still to incentivize people, then you are still in a situation where it's a while since I've stopped in a I've tried to use one of those chargers in a Tesco. But some of those sort of slower power chargers will still be free, because you'll get some, but not a huge amount of energy, so it's not kind of particularly costly. The rapid chargers will always be quite, will have a particular cost associated with them. Yeah.
Okay. So the next one is caravan ownership has increased. How does towing affect battery distance ability? Does charging exist that allows for caravans to be attached to the car during charging?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think we're at a fairly early stage. I mean, one of the original questions I always kept being asked was, can you tow? And there are an increasing number of electric vehicles where you can tow, but I think in fairness, that's it's still probably, you'd need to look carefully at which ones you have. And in exactly the same way as a petrol or diesel car, then yeah, if you tow something, it'll increase your energy usage. So yeah, that's certainly sort of something to bear in mind. And I think that's a really interesting one in terms of it's another aspect of, it's another sort of like a challenge would be, it'll depend on the sort of like the configuration of the of wherever you're charging. This is something I see that emerging in Norway. Norway, there's a lot of people there who use battery electric vehicles, and they're starting to then sort of configure the charging bays so that people can end up using their battery electric vehicle and then charge it without having to unhook their their caravan or whatever they're towing. I think we're probably still at a relatively early stage in that. So I think that could still probably be a bit of a challenge if I'm sort of frank, about that. But in just the same way as a couple of years ago, I'd have said, there's almost no battery electric vehicles that have tow bars. Now that you've got battery electric vehicles with tow bars and a range, then I think, give it a sort of 1 or 2 years or so, we'll be in a more sort of situation. It's a typical situation where as they become more routine, as they become more widely used, then the ability for you to kind of charge up easily with whilst you're towing will become more routine. Okay,
and don't worry, Laura. No need to apologise for all the questions. That's what we're here for.
No, not at all. No.
Some really, really fantastic questions there. One of the things from my perspective, I guess, is I think, Rich, you put up the maps of was it ZapMe maps that showed the...
Zap map, yeah.
So the Zap map stuff, one of the things that we're doing as part of the engagement for Zero Carbon Rugeley is kind of asking the community, well, where would you want to see more EV chargers locally? And with the whole sort of process that we have, which we call sort of user-centric design, it enables the community to kind of say, if I had to go to a public charger, this would be a really useful place to have it. This would be really helpful. Or these are the kind of places I think people would use it the most. So, once we post this video, if you have any other thoughts around that, or just anything in general about the things we post, your insight is collated and it is fed back into the sort of future design that we're doing for Zero Carbon Rugeley. So there's a real opportunity here to kind of have your say And we've collected some really great information so far about where people would want to see things like more EV chargers. So yeah, thank you very much for either attending, watching, or screaming profanity over Zoom. And thank you very much to Rich for coming along this evening and presenting this. As I say, I learned so much from that, and it was sort of really interesting to see the history of electric vehicles as well. They're sort of thrown at us as this new technology, and sometimes it's important to reflect that it's maybe not as new as we think it is, just more widely adopted. So yeah, thank you very much, everybody. And if that's all, then I guess we'll end it there. As I say, please do get in touch sort of retrospectively. If you have any thoughts or questions, I can always forward them on to Rich as well. So thank you.
Yeah, absolute pleasure. Thanks for coming in. As I say, if there are those of you who are interested in sort of exploring that sort of potential of making a the switch and feel you kind of would appreciate the opportunity to have a little bit of more of a conversation about your sort of like your use needs and potential vehicles out there, then I'll leave that in your hands, Adam and Ryan, in terms of I'd be happy to to arrange follow-up group either individually or either with a group of you. Be very happy to help.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Have a good night.